Hey guys, I think the video today is going to be a little bit shorter than the last couple have been because there's a little bit less material to cover today. Next time, we're going to start looking at some actual historical documents that outline the ideology and the structure of American government. Starting in about 1776, right? The year the United States declared independence from England. All right, so we're going to finish talking about the theory of classical liberalism today. Obviously, it'll come up a lot more over the course of my future videos, but next time we're going to switch gears and start talking about the actual history of the American system of government and how the way that it's designed is related to the theory that we've been talking about so far. All right, so the question I want you to start out thinking about today is just the question of, why should we have a government at all? This is a question I've asked you before. And at this point, we actually have a pretty good answer to that question. Just based on the economics that we've discussed so far, here's something that we know. Each individual person in a society has reason to support two things. First, everyone should support the free trade of goods and services based on comparative advantage. Why? Because free trade of goods and services based on comparative advantage is beneficial to everyone. Every single person in society can be benefited by free trade of goods and services based on comparative advantage, no matter who they are, no matter what it is that they would like to have, it's beneficial to them. So everyone should support that idea. Okay? Second, every individual person in a society has reason to support governments that solve collective action problems whose costs are greater than the cost of solving them. Right? And the reason is very much the same. Remember, collective action problems are just situations in which, when people behave rationally, they end up harming themselves as a result. Okay? And so, anyone who's reasonable, which is to say, anyone who has interests that they are trying to pursue, and who is doing so in a rational way, should support the solving of collective action problems. But like we talked about last time, solving collective action problems really requires interference from something like a government. All right? And so, anyone who lives in a society, no matter what their interests are, no matter what their skills are, no matter what their circumstances are, will be better off as a result of free trade of goods and services based on comparative advantage, and will also be better off if there is a government that works to solve collective action problems that are harming people. All right. Anyone in a society should support those two ideas. Now, from the point of view of classical liberalism, that's a big part of the reason why we should have governments. But it's not the only reason. I want you to think for a minute about what is required in order for free trade based on comparative advantage to work. I want you to think about what's required in order for a government to be able to solve collective action problems. Okay? What's required is for all of us to live in what philosophers sometimes call civil society. All right, civil society is basically when you have a group of people who all behave cooperatively and in a way that is mutually beneficial. All right, so most of us live in civil societies, right? We have friends, and when we're with our friends, we all cooperate. We get along, and spending time together is mutually beneficial. We live in families, and for most of us, our family is mostly get along, we cooperate, and we mutually benefit from our relationship. Most of us live in civil societies. But you actually have to have civil society on the level of an entire nation or of an entire society in order for free trade to really work effectively. All right? So, imagine if you didn't have a civil society. Imagine if, every time I produced something, instead of cooperating with me and trading, someone just stole it from me. Imagine that you and I agree to help build each other a house, okay? And we build your house first, and after we're finished with it, we're supposed to build my house. But after we finish yours, you decide that since you already have a house, you don't want to help out anymore, so you decide not to help me. In situations like that, it's not beneficial for me to trade with you. Okay, it's only beneficial for me to produce goods and services and to exchange them with other people if people respect my property rights, right? If people allow me to keep the things that are mine. And it's only beneficial for me to trade with people if they keep their contracts, right? When you and I agree to make a particular sort of trade, unless we both keep our side of the deal, it's not mutually beneficial. All right, it's important for people not to run around harming each other or killing each other, right? If people do those things, then interacting with people is not beneficial anymore, because interacting with them is just going to cause you harm. Okay? And so, in order for free trade, on the basis of comparative advantage to happen and to be beneficial to everyone, you have to live in a community where people respect each other's property rights, where people respect each other's health and safety and life, where people keep their promises. You have to live in a society where you have accurate information about what other people are able to produce, so that you can figure out what your comparative advantage is and make good trades on the basis of it, right? Civil society is all of these things, and without them, you can't have free trade on the basis of comparative advantage that benefits people. Okay? So, we have to have a civil society. Let me give you one more word, or phrase rather, that political philosophers use a lot. This phrase is the state of nature. The state of nature is basically just the condition in which people exist without any government. All right, that's what a state of nature is. And in the classically liberal tradition, the most basic question about government is this: does civil society exist in the state of nature? In other words, if you have a whole bunch of people existing with no government at all, is the result of that situation that everybody gets along and cooperates and respects each other's rights and gives each other free access to reliable information and keeps all of their promises and keeps from harming each other and trades in a way that's mutually beneficial and solves their collective action problems? And the classically liberal answer to this question is no. Okay, this idea comes originally from someone you've probably heard of, an English philosopher named Thomas Hobbes. And this is really where, historically, the classically liberal tradition gets started. Okay, it gets started from the idea that in a state of nature, you don't really have civil society. That if there is no government, the conditions of civil society, the conditions required for solving collective action problems and having free trade on the basis of comparative advantage, do not exist. Okay? And so the function of government ultimately is, according to the classically liberal tradition, this: governments are supposed to guarantee civil society. They are supposed to make sure that conditions are satisfied so that we can all trade freely on the basis of comparative advantage. And they are supposed to solve collective action problems for us. All right? You can make a list now of everything that this involves, okay? A civil society with free trade based on comparative advantage and with solutions to collective action problems requires a lot of things in order to work. First of all, like I already mentioned, it requires the free exchange of reliable information. If I don't have reliable information about what other people are producing in terms of goods and services, if I don't have reliable information about, how efficiently people are able to produce things, then it's impossible for me to trade on the basis of comparative advantage. All right. Second, you have to have property rights. Okay. If I don't have property to trade, and if the fact that it's my property is not respected, then trade becomes impossible, right? I have to be able to own things. I have to be able to, exchange them if I want to. I have to be able to buy or sell things. I have to be able to keep the things that I've bought or sold or made, right? All of that is required for free trade. Number 3, contracts have to be enforced. All right? A lot of goods and services that we exchange over time. I agree to provide you with something today, and in exchange, you're supposed to give me something tomorrow, something like that. Right? This is how credit cards work, for example. If people don't keep their contracts, then free trade stops working. Okay, number 4, people have to be able to associate freely with each other. If you can't freely associate with other people, you can't really trade with them. Okay, so free association is really important. Number 5, everybody's individual life and safety has to be protected when they're associating with other people, right? If every time I associate with other people in order to trade with them, they kill me, or they harm me, or they steal from me, then again, free trade based on comparative advantage stops working. Okay. Number 6, there have to be effective limitations on how much the government can interfere with individual liberty and with economic transactions. Why? Well, we talked before about what happens if the government does too much in order to collect and redistribute goods, right? The result is that the entire economy suffers. So you don't want the government to be able to do that. You also don't want the government to be able to take away things like my right to property, or my right to safety, or my right to free association, or my right to reliable information, right? If the government takes away those liberties, then again, free trade on the basis of comparative advantage becomes impossible. All right. 7, I have to have the liberty to pursue my interest in the light of my skills and circumstances. If I'm not able to pursue my interests, if I'm not able to produce the goods and services that I want, to exchange them for other goods and services that I want, then again, there's no civil society. There's no free trade based on comparative advantage. And finally, number 8, in order for this whole to work, even though there are limitations on what the government can do, the government still has to have enough power in order to incentivize the choices that people make so that they can solve collective action problems, right? The government has to have enough power to punish people who do the wrong thing, or to reward people who do the right thing, to solve collective action problems. All right? all of those conditions have to be met in order to have a civil society with free trade based on comparative advantage that solves collective action problems. All right? That's a lot of requirements. And there's a very natural question you might have about all of these requirements, which is just like, why should I accept all of this, right? Like, lots of societies don't work this way. Most societies, in fact, don't satisfy all of these conditions that I've just listed. Why should I want my society to satisfy them? And there's a very simple answer to that question from the point of view of classical liberalism. Here it is. All right. According to the classically liberal tradition, a government that satisfies all of those requirements is the only legitimate government. And the reason for that is because any citizen, any rational citizen, would voluntarily support that kind of government. Why? Well, because, like I said at the beginning, any rational citizen would support free trade based on comparative advantage, and any rational citizen would support solving collective action problems. And that just means that any rational citizen should support living in a civil society. And so when you make a list of all of the things that are required to maintain a civil society in a way that promotes free trade based on comparative advantage and still solves collective action problems, whatever that list of requirements is, those are the requirements that any rational citizen should support. All right? From the classically liberal point of view, that's what makes a government legitimate. What makes it legitimate is that all of the citizens, if they're being rational, will support it. All right? Now, keeping that in mind, I want you to think back to the very first video I made for this class, where I told you what the word liberal meant. And I told you that liberalism was the idea that individual rights and liberties should be respected. Why is the type of society that I just described liberal? Well, here's the answer. In this type of society, the only restrictions that are placed on individual liberties are restrictions that a free person who was rational would voluntarily accept. Why? Because those restrictions are just the restrictions that are required to solve collective action problems and maintain civil society. In other words, they are precisely the restrictions that are required to allow citizens to be free to pursue effectively their interests in light of their skills and circumstances. Okay, so anyone who is completely free and perfectly rational would freely accept the types of restrictions on their freedom that a classically liberal society would impose upon them. So the idea is that, restrictions on your freedoms in a classically liberal society are not restrictions that are forced on you. They're not restrictions that you are coerced into accepting. They are restrictions that are freely chosen. Right? And if you're freely choosing to limit your own liberty, you're still fundamentally and essentially free. It's still your choice. It's still your freedom to accept those limitations, right? What types of limitations am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the limitations that the government's going to impose when it solves a collective action problem, right? So when the government requires you to drive on the right instead of on the left, um, that's something that a free and reasonable person should accept, because restrictions like that are what allow citizens to effectively pursue their own interests. All right. So that finally is the fundamental idea of classical liberalism. Okay? Free trade, solving collective action problems, maintaining civil society. And according to the classical liberal, doing all of that requires having a government that is powerful enough to solve collective action problems, that guarantees that people's basic rights, rights to property, rights to life, rights to have reliable information, rights to associate with other people, rights to own things and buy things and sell things, and rights to be safe. All of those rights must be protected by the government. And, once the government solves collective action problems and protects all of those rights, there need to be very effective limitations on the government doing anything else, because doing more than that is actually a threat to the economic system that is beneficial to all citizens. All right? That's the core idea. Now, like I said, this isn't really a history class, right? Right now, I'm just trying to explain a general theory. If you want to know more about the history of this, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Okay. Briefly, this way of thinking about politics really starts with Thomas Hobbes, who I mentioned earlier today. And, the other really important figures are John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, and then, some of the American political thinkers who we're going to start talking about next time. All right. Some of the economic ideas that I've talked about, some of the political ideas that I've talked about start quite early, like in the 16th or 17th century. Some of them were not well understood until the very beginning of the 19th century. All right. So I've taken a lot of history and I've pretended that, people started to understand all of this at the same time. And that's not historically accurate, okay? But that historical inaccuracy is not really what's going to matter. What matters is that at a very early point in American history, everything that I've explained so far was pretty well understood. And this was the dominant way of thinking about politics and government during that period of time. All right, so next time we're going to start talking specifically about, some of the writings of the early American political leaders, and I will see you then.